Hi there, folks. Today we're looking at a review of factoring. So we're going to go over all the different methods by which we've factored things. This is going to be really important moving forward. So first of all, factoring itself is basically the reverse of the distributive property. Remember, the distributive property is when we multiply in. Factoring is when we divide things back out. All right. So when you think about the distributive property from the perspective of distributing a single term, all right, factoring is dividing that single term back out. When you think of it from the process of multiplying two binomials by distributing or foiling or something like that, factoring is going to be that factoring by grouping method that we're going to do to factor things back out. Okay. So again, all of these things are just the reverse of the distributive property, but we have different methods for factoring, for undoing the distributive property, because we have different types of distribution that we've looked at. Okay, so distributing is multiplying in, factoring is dividing out. The first one we're going to look at is factoring out the greatest common factor. Remember, the greatest common factor is the thing that divides evenly into each thing. All right, so when you take a look at this first one, I always start with the numbers and say, okay, between the 2 and the 6, they're each divisible by 2, so the greatest common factor has a 2 in it. And then when you look at the x to the 5th and the x to the 1st, the greatest common factor is an x to the 1st. They're each divisible by an x to the 1st. Because remember, when we divide, we're actually subtracting the exponents. So think of it this way: when you see variables, think about how many x's I can take away. The first one has 5. The second one only has 1. I can only take 1 x away from each. So it's a 2x that I factor out and I divide. 2x to the 5th divided by 2x is an x to the 4th. See, the 2's give me a 1, and I subtract the exponents. 6x divided by 2x is a 3. Again, 6 divided by 2 is a 3. X divided by x is a 1. Kind of cancels out. And that's it. And then we upgrade to factoring by grouping, which is essentially just doing the greatest common factor twice. All right? So factoring by groupings, where we put the terms in groups of 2 using parentheses. So I put them all in groups of 2. Then I factor out the greatest common factor from each group. I essentially do what I did in the previous 3 examples, but I do it twice. I do it with each of the groups that I've created. And then I factor out any common polynomials. I look for big chunks that are the same, and I take them out. For example, if I look at this guy, again, factor by grouping, I put them in groups. So I'm going to put these 2 together, and I'm going to put these 2 together. And remember to include the sign here when you do that. All right, that's an important part of this thing. Sorry, I erased too much. But now we just factor out of each of these groups. So I ignore the second group. Look at the 3n cubed minus 12n squared. The greatest common factor is a 3n squared. And now I divide out the 3n squared, which leaves me with an n minus 4. Okay? Out of the second group, I got to look for the greatest common factor. I can factor a 2 out, so I'm going to put a plus 2. And it's important to include the sign. Tell me whether you're factoring a positive 2 or a negative 2. So I factored that out. That leaves me with an n minus 4. And now I look for big chunks that are the same, and I should see that I've got this chunk of n minus 4 that they have in common. So basically, I'm going to take out the n minus 4, and if I were to take the n minus 4 and write it here, think about what would happen if I took the n minus 4 out of this first chunk of stuff. I'd be left with a 3n squared. And if I took the n minus 4 out of the second chunk of stuff, I'd be left with a plus 2. And so that's what happens. I just imagine what would happen if I took away the n minus 4s. I'd be left with a 3n squared plus 2. Those are my 2 factors, and I have to have parentheses around them because I'm undoing the distributive property from 2 binomials, okay? Let's talk about factoring trinomials. Remember, factoring trinomials, we're working our way to factoring by grouping. So we build a bridge. We multiply the first coefficient by the last coefficient. Then we come up with 2 numbers that multiply together to give me the bridge, but add to the middle coefficient. So again, build a bridge, and now I need 2 numbers that multiply to the bridge, but add to the middle number. All right, and that gets all 3 terms involved. Now I rewrite the middle term using those 2 values I just came up with, and then I factor by grouping. All right. And again, this is all review, so we're just kind of breezing through this. But here it is in practice. Remember, I build a bridge, so I do the 2 times the negative 6. And I have to include those signs as I build the bridge, so that's a negative 12. All right? So now I need 2 numbers that multiply to a negative 12, but add to the middle number, which is right here, it's a 1. Okay? And notice it's a positive 1, so I need 2 numbers that multiply to a negative 12, but add to a positive 1. So that's a positive 4 and a negative 3. All right? So now I rewrite the middle term. I do 2x squared plus 4x minus 3x. I rewrite that plus 1x as a 4x minus 3x because it's the same thing. I use those two values I came up with to rewrite middle term. Now I have 4 terms, so now I can do factor by grouping. Out of the first group, I can factor out a 2x. That leaves me with an x plus 2. Out of the second group, I can factor out a negative 3. That leaves me with an x plus 2. They have the x plus 2 in common, so that means my two factors are going to be the 2x minus 3 and the x plus 2. Okay? But again, we're essentially just getting this to a point where we can do factor by grouping. That's the goal when we factor trinomials. These guys, same kind of thing. So here I build a bridge, and notice there's a 1 out front here, so that gives me a negative 12. Now, two numbers that multiply to a negative 12 but add to a positive 4 are a positive 6 and a negative 2. And remember that on these, when you have a 1 out front, you're allowed to do a shortcut here. So you could split up the middle term factor by grouping like we just did. But when there's a 1 out front, remember you're allowed to go right to the answer and say, okay, it's going to be an x. And since this was a plus 6, it's going to be a plus 6. And then it's going to be an x. And since this was a minus 2, this is going to be a minus 2. And those are my two factors. And I am done if I could write a parenthesis. Okay? Remember, you can use that shortcut on these, but only when there's a 1 out front. All right?